Alright, quick Flask guide for leveling a new character. So in this video I'm going to show how to make the most of your flasks while progressing through the game on most builds. Some builds are a little bit different, but this is just a general new league, no pre-made gear leveling flask setup. Flasks are extremely important for both defense and for speed, so if you use them well it can really help you push to the end game a lot quicker. I'm going to go over which flasks are good and how to craft certain flasks, and I'm also going to give a few examples of like strong flask snapshots of what your flasks should look like at various points during progression. So your flasks start off like this. You know, everyone's seen this plenty of times, whatever. The first addition to your flask bar is going to be from killing Hail Rake and getting the Quicksilver. If your goal is to progress as quick as you can, this is probably the most important flask that you'll have through all of your progression. And it's really important to get this flask crafted as soon as you have an extra transmute available. And by an extra, I mean it's a transmute that you're not going to need to use to buy a stat amulet, not one that you need to buy your skill gems or support gems in Act 1, and not a transmute that you need to do your first vendor weapon craft. Those are all taking priority over this flask. But as soon as you have an extra one, you're going to want to throw it onto this flask. And even though it can't roll adrenaline, it still has a very strong pool of mods because it can only roll ample and a perpetual for prefixes, and it can only roll steadiness and resist for suffixes. Unfortunately, this one didn't hit resist, and I wouldn't recommend actually using alts, but just to show it. There it is, of resistance. And that resist roll is going to make your character much more durable during your progression. But like I said, if you don't hit it on the transmute, it's generally not worth it to use alts until much later where you have a lot of extra alts just sitting in your inventory. Now onto the life and the mana flasks. The first real upgrade you're going to need here over your small life flasks is you need a large life flask. Mediums are good if you find one just from monsters while progressing, but unless you're really desperate for a new life flask, you generally don't want to buy one from the vendor. Now for racing and other people that are pushing ladder, it's really common to wait until lower prison to go back to town, because that's when you get your quest reward, and then you also will check the vendor for a large life flask. This is key because you want the large life before Brutus, since having this flask will allow you to tank his damage a lot easier and it'll help you kill him much quicker. After Brutus, you're pretty much done buying flasks for Act 1. That's the only one you're going to grab. But you definitely still want to be on the lookout for potential upgrades to your other life flask or getting a second mana flask to fill out your last empty mana spot. For Act 2 onwards, you're not so much looking to hit certain breakpoints on your flasks like the large life flask. You're kind of just looking for life flasks as you can use them. So level 12 you want graders, level 18 you want grand, and then for mana flasks you just need whatever you can get to make sure you're not running out of mana against bosses. Now as far as the greater flasks go, I think the greater mana is actually more important than the greater life flask, because this is the first real mana flask that'll help keep your mana topped off, especially against bosses like the bandits and like Vol. Greater Life Flask is great if you find one, but you shouldn't look to buy one from the vendor assuming you have your large life, because a large life can carry you through most of Act 2. However, if you are sitting on a large life towards the later parts of Act 2, you do want to check your vendors from level 18 onwards and try and get a Grand Flask, since that's a 2-step upgrade that'll give you a lot more power fighting the bosses at the end of Act 2 and then progressing through most of Act 3. So somewhere around the middle to the end of Act 2, this isn't a hugely uncommon setup to look like. You're going to want a Grand Life Flask, you're going to want a second Life Flask that's at least large or better, and you want 2 mana flasks, because for most classes, if you get some bad luck on Vol, 1 mana flask may not be enough. You may straight up run out of mana before he dies, because once you hit level 18 and you get those extra support gems, you really start pumping through your mana super quickly. And then the giant mana flasks are in pretty much the same boat as the graders and the grand. if you upgrade from a grand to a giant, it's not hugely important. It's not life or death. But if you're sitting on a greater, you definitely want to start checking vendors again and get this giant as soon as you can. The giant mana flask is probably the best mana flask that you'll find through all of progression, because it's the first one that really makes a huge jump in how much mana it gives you per second. And it can actually last most builds all the way through to like Dried Lake and maps if you need to do maps. Because if you compare it to, say, your greater, this one gives somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-ish, low 20s mana per second, and this one gives almost 50 mana per second. It's twice as much as a greater. And the only real reason you're going to want to replace this flask is if you are using an extremely mana intensive build and you need one with even a higher mana per second, or if you find a mana flask that's good enough and is magic with like a good suffix on it. Now, once you hit Colossal Flasks, this is kind of where things change up quite a bit. This is the first set of at least life flasks that you're going to start throwing currency on and looking for specific roles. Because getting bubbling or seething for the instant healing will make progressing through Act 4 and everything beyond that much less terrifying, and it'll allow you to push through zones a lot faster. For Colossals specifically, I would recommend not using alterations, only transmutes, as you'll probably find a few of these as just drops. So you just keep picking them up as you find them. Throw a transmute on. If it hits an instant heal, great. If not, you probably put it on anyway and replace your weakest flask. And you're just going to keep kind of doing that until you either hit an instant roll or you're high enough level to use the next tier of flasks. But before we get to that tier, I want to quickly hop back to the utility flasks, because hopefully by this point you have found a second Quicksilver, or if you haven't, you've at least found some sort of utility flask like a bismuth or a granite or a silver flask or something that's usable, and you can put it in place of your second mana potion. And the second utility flask is really important because assuming it's at least item level 5 or higher, it's able to roll the adrenaline mod, which you haven't been able to get on your first Quicksilver. So again, you want to make sure to transmute one of these as soon as you're using it, and this is probably the first flask that you really want to throw some alterations into in search of adrenaline. Unless it is a bismuth flask, I would not recommend it because you will probably be replacing that one down the line. So back to life flasks. We've now got 2 utilities on, we've got 2 life, and we've got the 1 mana. This is pretty much the normal setup you'll be seeing for the rest of your progression. Sacred life flasks are a slight upgrade over Colossal, and it's another one that you're going to be hunting for that instant heal mod. If you don't have any instant heal flasks at this point, you didn't find one on your Colossals, this is when you should start using alterations to find one as soon as you possibly can. Having the instant roll here for basically the end of Act 4 and all those bosses and then everything past that just makes your life so much easier, being able to instantly top yourself off if you take a huge chunk of damage. And the Sacred Mana Flask, if you are a mana intensive build, is the next one after the Giant that is actually worth upgrading to. It's a slightly higher mana per second roll. So around this point, you're finishing up Act 4 normal, or you're getting started on Cruel, and from here on, changing your flasks slows down. Normal, you're changing your flasks multiple times per act. After normal, not so much. Stuff stays relatively the same. But the first thing you're going to want to go for in Cruel, if you don't have one already, is you want to go to Hail Rake again, because this time you get either a silver flask if you are a build that can use it, or if you're a build that doesn't make use of a silver, you can get a second Quicksilver, and they're guaranteed magic flasks. So if you're a build that does want the silver, you're going to put it on right away, and you're probably going to use alterations if you have them to search for resists or adrenaline or staunching, just some good suffix, because this flask in this combo of some Quicksilver plus some sort of silver flask are going to last you all the way through the rest of your progression. So assuming all your other flasks, your life flasks, are good up to this point, there's pretty much only one other change to your flasks that you're going to make through all of Cruel, and that is getting a Hallowed life flask with an instant heal roll. This flask heals almost twice as much as the Colossal and the Sacred, and you can use it as your main instant heal potion pretty much all the way up to maps. Once you have one, it's up to you whether you want to run 2 instant flasks. So you could have, for example, let's get one of these rolled. Hopefully, seething of grounding. So you could either run a seething and a seething, or bubbling and a seething, or instead of having an instant heal on your second flask, you can just have a regular life flask, and that's really mostly preference. When I'm playing squishy builds, I really like to have 2 instant flasks because there's a lot more panic moments, but if you're relatively tanky, I think it's pretty good to have a 1 instant and one that heals you up over time, since you can kind of use them together. But at this point, this is a pretty solid flask setup that will last you from the early parts of Cruel all the way until near the end of Merciless. So this is the second to last kind of snapshot you're going to look for your flasks. And there's really only 1 flask left on your journey to Merciless Dried Lake, because the next tier of flasks, the Sanctifieds, I don't think they're personally worth using. This one uses way too many charges compared to the Hallowed, and it heals for less. It's a good non-instant flask, but you don't really want to be hunting for those. And the Sanctified Mana Flask, not only is it worse than the Hallowed Flask, it's also worse than the Sacred Mana Flask, and it's worse than the Giant Mana Flask in my opinion. So those are out of the options. But there is one more flask that you want, and hopefully you find one on your own, but if not, you will get it during Act 2 Merciless, and that is a Granite Flask. Like I said, you want to keep a lookout for one to drop while you're progressing, but they're pretty rare, so it's not very likely that you'll actually find one. And if you don't, the Act 2 Sins quest reward will give you one as an option, and you definitely want to take that. Now, as far as using this flask, you have a few options of where to put it, but you're definitely going to want it on to deal with strong physical damage spikes that you're going to see during Act 3 and Act 4 in Merciless. Now, if you're going for pure speed and you're trying to push ladder as quick as possible, obviously you don't want to replace either of these flasks since they give you a lot of that speed. So you can either replace your second life flask if you're confident in your ability to stay alive, or you can replace your mana flask if you're running clarity or something to help you sustain your mana without the flask. But if you want to play it safe and you need the mana flask, you can just drop the silver flask and you'll probably still be just fine. So a normal ladder pushing setup may look something like this, where you've got your 1 strong instant flask, you've got your mana flask, and then you've got triple utility, ideally with 1 with adrenaline. Nothing here has a resist roll, but you probably look for one of those. So maybe the silver flask has a resist roll. You've got your granite, and you've got your healing. And this is the kind of setup that you will see from pretty much Act 2 Merciless all the way through to your Dried Lake farming and until the start of maps. The only thing left is Divine Life Flasks, which you don't need for anything outside of maps really, because your health pool generally won't be very high. But once you're in Merciless Dried Lake, I would recommend looking out for these, especially for ones that are already rolled magic or have quality. You're going to want to grab those and hopefully get some instant ones before you start mapping, and hopefully get like a good combo. Like Bubbling Divine is very strong. And with that, you're pretty much set. Your flasks are done, everything's good to go, and life is good. So thanks for watching everybody, and I hope that the video helps you out when you're starting in the next league.